Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Timothy Lombardo, author of Blue Collar Conservatism.
Timothy Lombardo, author of Blue Collar Conservatism, Frank Rizzo's Philadelphia, and Populist Politics. Why a book about Frank Rizzo now?
Well, truth be told, this isn't a now book. This is a book I've been working on for close to a decade. This book started out as my dissertation, which I defended. I finished in 2013, and I've been spending some bit of time on it and all that. It turned out to be really interesting timing, not only with certain things that are happening within the city, within discussions of whether or not to keep the statue of Rizzo that's across the street from City Hall, with the election of Donald Trump during the 2016 campaign, several people began making the comparison between them. And so there's been, I think, more interest than I expected there to be when I began the book, not 8 or 9 years ago, or began researching it 8 or 9 years ago. The timing has been it's been good for getting people to think about him, getting people to think about the type of people who voted for him.
Now, you said before we started that you grew up in Philadelphia.
I did.
What were you told about? What did you know about Frank Rizzo as you were growing up?
You knew he was controversial. I was born at the tail end of Rizzo's mayoralty. And so I never knew him personally. Although I do have vague memories of him running again in like 1987 and 1991. I have those vague memories. I knew he was a controversial figure. I knew people either loved him or hated him. And you grow up with the stories of the nightstick and the cummerbund, some of the really outlandish statements he would make, and some of the silly statements he would make. But I knew of him before. I obviously knew who he was, and growing up I knew who he was, and I was a history student, so I learned who he was, but I really didn't get to know him that well until I started getting into the book and really getting into who he was and why people were drawn to him.
So this is your dissertation for doctorate?
Yes, this was my doctoral dissertation that I did several years ago, and then the book was a product or a revision of that.
And what was the point of your dissertation? I mean, what were you aiming at?
Same thing that I aimed at in the book. I was thinking about American political history, and I was thinking about the types of. Thinking about conservatism, the rise of conservatism is a major emphasis in modern American political history. It's probably the thing that political historians have been focused on the most because that is the story of the 20th century, is the rise and fall of liberalism, the rise of the Republican Party, the rise of the right. And I, being a scholar, I'd read a lot of books that were about this. And then, you have the broad overviews that look at your Goldwaters, that look at your Reagans, you look at those figures, or you have the type of things that take a locality like I did, and they try to do something a little bit more in depth, a little bit history a little more from the bottom up, and not just those central figures. I was reading a lot of those books, and they were excellent books, great books, but there were books on Atlanta, books on suburban communities in the South, suburban communities in the West, books on those areas. And as I was reading these books, what I said to myself is, like, something seems missing here. There's something that I'm not seeing in this. And that's when I started thinking about home. I started thinking about where I came from, and started to think about, the sort of, not the people that were in the suburbs, the people who didn't leave the city, and the people who were there, and then I start thinking about a figure like Rizzo, and when I looked into it further, and it's one of the points I make in the book now, is that when we're looking at American political history, we're not we shouldn't be looking for the rise of conservatism. We should be looking for the rise of conservatisms, that there's different forms of this ideology, different forms of this political movement. And what I'm arguing in this book is that what I'm looking at is this specifically urban, working and middle class, lower middle class movement represented in Frank Rizzo is something of its own that I call blue collar conservatism.
Well, you also include in your subtitle populist politics. What
Yes.
does populist mean?
So populist is such a difficult word to define because it means so many different things in so many different contexts. My use of it comes down to the way people saw Rizzo as or the way his supporters saw Rizzo, because he had plenty of detractors. The way his supporters saw him as a man of the people, a man like them, as they say in the book, as that he was one of us. Right, and that I come to say is, in addition to everything else that sort of made up Rizzo's appeal, that he was, he wasn't an elite. If you look at the people who sort of come before Rizzo in the mayor's office, his immediate predecessor is James H.J. Tate, who himself comes from at least a working class background, but he is a lifelong politician. Before that, you have Richardson Dilworth. You have Joseph Clark. These were the guys that sort of wrested the city away from a long corrupt Republican machine. But these were blue-blooded Ivy League lawyers and just not people from the neighborhood. Rizzo was from the neighborhood. He grew up in South Philadelphia, and people saw that about him. And they say, they saw when he succeeded, they saw it as sort of their own success. The guy who dropped out of high school, worked his way up through the police department, and then would go on to become mayor. And for especially white ethnic, working class Philadelphians or white Philadelphians, anyway, saw him as sort of a champion of who they were. He was a guy who was going to stick up for them against the whims of, in their language, liberal elites, and in their language, those who tried to threaten their traditions or values.
What was it about Frank Rizzo? I mean, how did he emerge from being just another cop to being commissioner and then mayor?
Well, I don't know if it would be fair to call Rizzo just another cop. Rizzo was, from his early days in the police force, he was easily a larger than life figure. I mean, he was a type of person who stood out. His father was a police officer, and his father, you could argue, was kind of just another cop. His father never really had the ambition to go farther in the department. But Rizzo used connections, he was an aggressive police officer, more so than anything. And he started getting attention, at least from within the department, in the mid to late 50s, like long before he was commissioner. Just for his willingness to tackle any sorts of things. I guess one of the first things he gets known for in the police department is he's cracking down on coffee houses and illegal clubs that were hotspots for the gay community in Philadelphia in the 1950s. He builds on that and he starts working his way up, and he gets transferred. He keeps getting transferred to different precincts, or not transferred, promoted. But in each one, people complain. He's getting complaints, but other cops love him. In 63, he's named deputy commissioner in charge of uniformed personnel because he is what they call a cop's cop. He's the guy. He's not the police commissioner in the 1960s is Howard Leary, and Howard Leary is an educated man. He's well versed in modern law enforcement practices. The majority of the Philadelphia Police Department in the 1960s are white, blue-collar, people who come from working-class backgrounds. But policing is a job you can do with a high school education and make a fairly decent living at. And that's what they see in Rizzo. He's not the egghead at the top. Rizzo is the beat cop who's looking out for the cops who are also doing that hard work. And so he's not just a regular. He's standing out to begin with, but he gets his first chance to run the department on his own in '66 when his predecessor After Howard Leary left, his predecessor, Ed Bell, takes ill, and he gets a chance, and he uses that chance to conduct raids on local civil rights organizations and things people he thinks are dangerous radicals. And
Was he taking liberties there? I mean, while his boss was
yes,
sick, he just said, "All right,
yes,
I'm the boss
absolutely. Yeah. The organization he targeted was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. SNCC was they only had a very small presence in the city, but they had a much larger presence nationwide. And very famously, the year before, Stokely Carmichael had started using the phrase "Black Power." And Rizzo was insistent on, what he said is eliminating the Black Power threat in the city, and it was growing. And so the city has a vibrant civil rights movement. He accused SNCC of planning. I believe, if I want to remember, it's planning to bomb Independence Hall. SNCC claimed that they planted explosives, that the police planted explosives. Rizzo said that wasn't true, and it's almost impossible to tell who was lying and who was telling the truth there. But Rizzo was making it clear to a lot of people where he stood on the issue of law and order, where he stood on the issue of civil rights, and things like that. And a lot of what this book is, as I framed it, and you asked me earlier about what made me look into it in the first place. One is that other side of conservatism. The other side, what I've always envisioned this book as, is the other side of the story of civil rights in Philadelphia. The civil rights movement, and that story has been told wonderfully by some other really great scholars. This is the other side of that story. This is the white response to it, and the white response was to get behind someone like Rizzo.
Is that what caused the rise of blue-collar conservatism, a reaction to the civil rights movement?
Primarily, yes. But I also argue that while that is the catalyst, there was a lot more nuance in it than we're used to thinking. This is the standard narrative of white working class anti-liberalism, white working class conservatism in the 60s going into the 70s, is that this was a racist backlash against the advances of the civil rights movement, against the rise of Black Power and all of that. And that's all true. And I don't dispute any of that. But I do argue that they approach it a lot more with a lot more nuance and a lot more, in a lot of ways, political savvy than we often give credit for, because they're not. They're conscious of what the civil rights movement looked like in the South. They're conscious of what it looked like when Bull Connor released the dogs in Birmingham, right? And they're not talking about maintaining segregation. And and a lot of the book, I think, is really about political language. They're not talking about maintaining segregation. They're talking about maintaining white ethnic traditions. They're not talking about maintaining. My three big case studies when it comes to desegregation are schools, housing, and employment. When I'm looking at blue collar employment, it's not especially in my case, it was the construction unions. It's not construction unions saying we need to stay all white. It's saying this is about labor rights. This is about work. When it comes to public housing, it's not because or at least they're saying it's not because the potential tenants of public housing are African American. It's because they didn't work hard to get there. In the school, it's not about wanting to maintain all white schools. It's about maintaining the tradition of neighborhood schools. In all of these cases, my point is that language matters. That the adoption of that phrasing matters, because it gets internalized, and it's instead of talking about race, they talk about class. They talk about their blue collar identities. That's hence the name blue collar conservatism. At the same time, each one of those things still reinforces the same segregation that was there in the first place, right? And it's even though it's the same end, the shift in that political language is sort of key to understand and to understanding how class and class identity especially plays a major role in the rise of what I call blue collar conservatism.
When you talk about the white working class, who are you talking about? I mean, how big a group was it? What were the ethnicities? What work did they do?
So I prefer to use the term blue collar to white working class. I sometimes use them interchangeably because I talk about blue collar identity, white blue collar identity, as something a little bit more fluid, something a little bit more all-encompassing. So who I'm talking about are, those you would traditionally think of working class, construction workers, people in like longshoremen, people in those kind of jobs. But I'm also kind of including a lower middle class that is perhaps a little bit more upwardly mobile, probably moving past those old union jobs and things like that, but still maintaining those ethnic and neighborhood values that were important in older working class neighborhoods. So for me, it's some of it's about employment. And so I look an awful lot at unions, at the building and construction trade unions, which are one of the more powerful unions in the city in the 1960s. But I really look at neighborhoods. I look at South Philadelphia a lot, and I look at Northeast Philadelphia a lot, and these old neighborhoods that are adjusting to these new challenges. And in Northeast Philadelphia, you have new neighborhoods traversing this very similar challenges, but from a different perspective. But also doing so with this sort of blue collar identity in mind. And it's the reason I choose to look at it. I look at it that way is because it's very fluid. Rizzo himself provides probably the best case in point, is that Rizzo, born and raised in a row home in South Philadelphia, but as his career expands and he's moving up from beat cop to deputy commissioner to police commissioner to mayor, it's hard to really say he's not really working class anymore, but he's still blue collar, and people still see him as a blue collar figure, even though he's got a very large home in Chestnut Hill by the time he's mayor, and he's got a lot more trappings of people who have a lot more money, but he's still culturally blue collar, even if he's not economically working class. And that's sort of a distinction I make there.
How did the blue collar workers vote before Frank Rizzo came along?
Generally, even with Rizzo, they tended to vote Democrat. And one of the things I kind of include in this is what I call a selective rejection of welfare liberalism, in that they're not completely turning away. And one of the reasons, as I said earlier, that we need to not look at the rise of conservatism, but the rise of conservatisms, is that there's subtlety and nuance. And not everybody was a Goldwaterite. Not everybody was, there in 1970s. You see in California, there's the rise of the tax revolt. This isn't who these people are. These are people who are still interested in federal programs and federal money, and federal grants.
So they didn't vote for Goldwater in '64?
I'm sure some did, but most of them. These were Kennedy folks. The people I'm looking at are, working lower middle class, primarily Catholics. These were Kennedy people. These were people that supported Dilworth, and so when Clark and Dilworth sort of, like I said earlier, wrested power away from this long corrupt political machine, promising good government, promising city planning, effective city planning, promising urban renewal, the people I'm looking at were all in. They didn't really, they never fully trusted Dilworth, because Dilworth, wasn't like them, and Dilworth was from like a wealthy family, so they never. It's not that they liked Dilworth, but they liked what he was selling, and they liked those ideas. Jim Tate, who's Rizzo's predecessor, he's kind of gruff. He's working class, but he's actively seeking out federal funding for urban renewal and for highway construction, and doing these sort of mid-century urban liberal, following the mid-century urban liberal formula. And Rizzo doesn't entirely back off from that. He talks very conservative, and he talks very culturally conservative, but economically there is still a promotion of especially urban funding and urban renewal, urban the plan by the 70s is urban conservation, and so the people I'm saying aren't saying get government out of our lives. They're saying we want government to work for the people who deserve it and not the people who don't, and that's the distinction that they're making. Urban renewal is great because it helps people like them. Public housing is not, because it helps people who didn't work hard for it, and that's the distinction. So it's not that liberalism or government programs, that sort of the economic side of liberalism is inherently bad. It just wasn't working for the right people. In some cases, it worked too well for the wrong people in their mind.
What was going on in Philadelphia? What was it like right then that caused the atmosphere that made Frank Rizzo the person they gathered around?
There are several factors in this. And the one side is all of the sort of economic desegregation side. The other side is the rise of crime. There are rising rates of crime there, and there's in 1964 in North Philadelphia, the largest of the series of urban uprisings that strike American cities in the 1960s hits Philadelphia, called the Columbia Avenue riot. It's 3 days of 3 days of disorder, looting, rioting, so on and so forth, that began as almost every single one of these did in the 1960s. What seemingly minor police incident, in this case a pair of police officers trying to arrest an intoxicated couple who were arguing in the street. But rumors spread through North Philadelphia that they were abusing women. I think the rumor was that the police had struck a pregnant woman, and so like the same thing we would see a month earlier in Harlem, same thing we would see in Detroit and Watts and Newark. And this is what happened. This is happening in Philly, and that's a catalyst. That's a catalyst for, especially a catalyst for supporting the police in the face of this. And it's interesting, and it's something I don't quite get into as much as I probably should in the book, but police have not always been thought of positively in urban America. I mean, police professionalization by the 1960s is only about a century old, and for a very long time, it was not a job that most people thought well of. It was, a job immigrants got, and it was a job that there is widespread distrust of police officers for much of the first half of the 20th century. That begins to shift as the main focus of a lot of urban police departments becomes a focus on either urban disorder or civil rights protests, and that's what happens in Philadelphia. And so there's what I call the establishment of this culture of reverence for the police, especially among the people I'm talking about, white, blue-collar Philadelphians. And it first comes between throwing support behind the police who are not only who have a hard job, and that's the way they frame it. This is about the hard work of police work, but that then deals intersects with everything else I'm talking about. One point I try to make is that we can't look at what historians refer to as the politics of law and order. Something Goldwater traded on it, George Wallace did, Richard Nixon. Historians credit law and order be the single biggest factor in the election of '68 that saw Nixon win. And Rizzo is arguably the clearest example of that, moving from law enforcement to politics on a local level. But you can't remove that from school desegregation, because there were disturbances in the schools, and they saw this as a breakdown of law and order in the schools. You can't remove that from the controversies over equal opportunity politics and what will later be called affirmative action, because the police are working these protests. And same thing with public housing and all the other things I discussed. It's all interwoven, but the Columbia Avenue riot is the catalyst that then just gets pulled into all of these other issues.
How did the police react to the Columbia Avenue riots?
Interestingly, actually, as I mentioned earlier, the police commissioner at the time was a man named Howard Leary, and Howard Leary had a reputation as somebody who, he wasn't to borrow colloquialism here, he wasn't a shoot first, ask questions kind of guy. He thought the best thing to do was build bridges between communities and the police force. Very famously, Cecil B. Moore, who was a fiery leader of the Philadelphia NAACP, and a far more militant leader than you would find in any other branch of the NAACP, probably anywhere else in the country. a very big critic of the police. Nevertheless, he calls Howard Leary one of the finest policemen in the country, or the most enlightened policeman in the country, I believe. And so the specific way they dealt with it was to basically quarantine. It's around 22nd and Ridge Avenue on what was in Columbia. Columbia Avenue is now Cecil B. Moore Avenue in this today. But rather than go in there and start arresting people, they tried not to let it spread and made as few arrests as possible and tried to let it cool down on its own, and enlisting the work of local civic leaders to kind of calm people down, and it worked. It was still incredibly damaging. There's still problems throughout the community, but if you compare North Philadelphia to Watts, or if you compare North Philadelphia to Harlem, it was far less catastrophic. And Howard Leary gets tremendous praise from across the country for attempting to deal with this uprising in a more civil manner. The problem with that is that it specifically enraged Rizzo, who was on the scene that night and was told not to go out there and not to go out there and beat people up, which is what he would have preferred to do. And that handling of it, despite the praise that Leary gets in a lot of other places, and in Philadelphia, because of that performance, Howard Leary will be recruited and named police commissioner of the NYPD within a few years. But it leaves a lot of Philadelphians angry, especially white Philadelphians who don't see this. This didn't happen in their neighborhood, and they don't see what it's like. All they're hearing about is from the media, and they're hearing about people who are saying the police weren't allowed to do their jobs. The police they had their hands tied, and that becomes the main way of sort of framing this. You tying the hands of the police, tying the hands of those who are trying to protect. And one of the things Rizzo is very clear. Rizzo is in every way possible the opposite of Howard Leary. And one of the things he's clear about is he will never hamstring the police if they're trying to do their jobs. And that is something a lot of people are responding to. And so I say there are two prongs to what I call blue-collar conservatism. The first, as I mentioned earlier, is this selective rejection of welfare liberalism, and the other is this law enforcement conservatism, more punitive policies, harsher treatment of supposed criminals, and much more unfettered responses from the police than you would have found under someone like Howard Leary.
What kind of reaction did all these things, Frank Rizzo and the Columbia Avenue riots, get from the working class African Americans, the blue collar black community?
So there was they made. It's interesting. So I'm actually working on a small side project about this very thing. They made this distinction between law and order and law and justice. At least the community leaders. Those are the voices I've seen, and it's. The riot wasn't good for anybody's community. Nobody was praising the riot. No one was praising this uprising. You had some people who would say, well, this is what you expect to happen. But what they're saying in response to it is, we need jobs programs. We need job training programs. We need local, state, federal government to step in and do something about the conditions that led to things being so desperate in this community anyway. That we need programs so that the relationship between police and the African American community isn't so hostile. That they need all of these things. Rizzo's response is no. Rizzo's response, and not just Rizzo, but the people who like Rizzo see that as rewarding criminality. And so that's how they frame this, right? That if they riot, now they're going to get social programs. And they're like, well, that's that, and they say that's not fair. A lot of this is about things people perceive to be fair. And so their response is, stricter law and order. The other African Americans are not saying no law and order. They're saying law and justice. Like we want you to do something about the criminal elements. We want you to do something about. Nobody wants riots, but can we do so in a way that is mutually respectful and respectful to the community? And there are community leaders that reach out to Rizzo, and we want this. We want peace too. We want crime to go down too, but can you do so with it while being respectful to people who aren't criminals in our community? And I mean, so in a broader sense, in the 1960s and 1970s, this isn't just in Philadelphia. This is nationwide. The twin problems in a lot of African American communities or inner city communities was both over-policing and under-policing. Like the over-policing of innocent people and the assumption of guilt and the assumption of because somebody else in this neighborhood committed a crime, that means everyone is suspect. And the other side of that coin was under-policing, because these were areas that crime did happen, and people the African Americans wanted police to take care of that, but to be respectful of their community at the same time and not assume everybody was a criminal.
Now, talking about this period, the mid-1960s, and so were blue-collar jobs and the union trade construction jobs open to African Americans at the time?
Barely. And it's important. This is an important thing or an important point, at least in the 1960s, and this will change going into the 1970s. But blue-collar jobs are really, really, I mean, as lucrative as they have been and are going to be. There is so much federal money coming in, and not just to Philadelphia, but every big city. So much federal money coming into construction projects. With the highways are being completed. I-95 in Philadelphia will not be completed until until 1968, I believe, right? And so that is good. That's a good paying union job. There are federal buildings. One of the major federal building projects in the 60s is, I want to say, it's a multi-billion dollar or $1 million construction of the new U.S. Mint facility. These are all federal jobs, all of them union jobs, all of them. But the building and construction trades were almost exclusively white. And that's why, for much of the 1960s, one of the main targets of the civil rights movement is the building and construction trades. Not only is there's a cultural capital that came with being a construction worker. It was good work. It was honest work, and it was honorable work. But it was also, in the 1960s, pretty well-paying work for a blue-collar job, especially, high school education. You get into the union, and you can actually make pretty decent, money, like single breadwinner money. But because of the way the unions worked in the 1960s, especially the construction unions, is that they made a number of deals in the 50s and 60s to control the training processes. So you can't just go in and be an electrician. There's a training process that goes through that, and you can't just go in and it's not just these are jobs that take at least some sort of journeyman status to get through. The problem is they tended to recruit from within their own neighborhoods. They recruit from within their own families in a lot of cases. And one point I make is, for a blue-collar family from a working-class neighborhood in Philadelphia, one of the most important things a father could bestow to his son is entry into a union, and that was important. But because they came from families, because they came from neighborhoods, Philadelphia is an incredibly segregated city in the 1960s, one of the most segregated cities in the country. Not by the sort of Jim Crow legislation we're familiar with when we look at the South, but through extra legal measures, through policies, and through a number of other reasons. And so when the unions are recruiting from within their own neighborhoods and within the communities, they're remaining exclusively white, even if they say not on purpose. They all claim this is not about excluding African Americans. This is about proper channels. And so because civil rights leaders in the city make such a make these jobs such a central focus, and because they're good jobs, because they're excluded. The Johnson administration, followed by the Nixon administration, will respond with one of the very first pilot programs for federally enforced, what we would call affirmative action. It was called the Philadelphia Plan. They tried one in a few other cities, but this is the one that actually worked. This would be the blueprint for affirmative action nationwide. And it never satisfied either side. There were never, like a lot of programs, especially the Nixon administration sort of used it to draw to, in a lot of ways, to put a wedge between two usually Democratic constituencies, unions and African Americans. So it never really satisfied anything, but it managed to alienate a number of white union workers.
What did it involve?
Several different aspects. First was, the one that would eventually be struck down. There were two versions of it. One was a quota system, that you have to have this many non-white workers on everything, and that would be struck down. That was actually that was illegal because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So that didn't work. What it turned to was goals and timetables, right? So you had to have some sort of they needed to have some sort of set path for bringing more African Americans and more people of color into their unions, and that meant that they needed to open up their training facilities to more, and that was that's a much slower process. Quotas would have made things a little quicker, but that was illegal. So it was these long-term goals and timetables to integrate to have a more integrated workforce.
Speaking of Philadelphia's segregated neighborhoods, would you tell the story about Lillian Wright moving into Kensington?
Yeah. So Lillian Wright, I should back up. So Philadelphia's neighborhoods are shifting. Philadelphia has this reputation as a city of neighborhoods. It's something we still say. Philadelphia calls itself a city of neighborhoods. But while boundaries shift, and they're constantly shifting. And this was especially in areas like Kensington, were often buffers. These were the places in between. And Kensington is, in the 1960s, is caught in between two very different shifts in the city. One is a population boom in North Philadelphia, and this is primarily African American newcomers, people coming from the South, people coming from other areas, moving into North Philly, because that is where it is affordable to live, and because of that, North Philadelphia, or the boundaries of what is North Philadelphia, begin to expand. Kensington is likewise caught in between the growth of Northeast Philadelphia, which had a few older neighborhoods in the lower Northeast, but further northeast much of it was farmland. There was still farmland in the city in the 1950s. And they're kind of caught in between this. And so Kensington sort of feels the pressure on both ends. You see these upwardly mobile, some of them also working class, some are middle class people, moving to Northeast Philadelphia, and these growing working class African Americans in North Philadelphia who are pushing out of what is traditionally North Philadelphia and into what is Kensington. And the first woman to do so is Lillian Wright, an African American woman who is at first she is separated or estranged from her husband, but her and her kids are going to rent this house in Kensington, and they're going to be the first black family in that community until the white neighbors get wind of it. They see her moving in, and what will ensue is 5 nights of increasingly hostile unrest, including people throwing things at her houses, chanting, marching past her house to protest an African American woman moving into an all-white neighborhood. And she will, her family, she will get back together with her husband, who will move in, and they live like this for a few months until they can no longer take it. The hostility becomes too much, and they leave and they go back to another area in North Philadelphia. But there's a contrast here. 2 years earlier is the uprising in North Philadelphia because of the deterioration of police relations with the police. And 2 years later, you have this other riot, the Kensington riot, which is a riot to force an African-American family out of the neighborhood. And they succeed. The white community succeeds in that. And Kensington becomes, because of all these other things, Kensington is a declining neighborhood. Kensington is, barely, at least economically, barely any better than North Philadelphia, or maybe a few degrees. And they're tenaciously fighting for whatever they have left there. And to them, they see the encroachment of an African-American family as a sign that their neighborhood's going in a direction they don't want. And they become a symbol of this, the white backlash in Philadelphia. Great longtime Philadelphia journalist Peter Binzen wrote a book called about Kensington called White Town USA, and I think the long subtitle was How the Silent Majority Lives, Thinks, and there's a couple other things there, but it's a brilliant, a really great up close look at what Kensington looked like and why their response to it, to this community.
The other one I want to ask about is Whitman and the Whitman neighborhood and Whitman Park.
So yes, and Whitman Park was, this was one of the things that got me further into this or further into this project than anything else. One of the things you should pick up, you're probably picking up on as we're getting through this is. This is about Rizzo, but it's not a biography of Rizzo. This is about the people who support him, and it's really about these neighborhoods and these neighborhood conflicts. And Whitman is one of the longest. Whitman was one of these communities that in fact Whitman didn't exist. I mean, it did. It was a community, but didn't have a name. It was this. Some people called it the Neck because it was not far from the confluence of the Schuylkill and Delaware rivers in South Philadelphia. It was sort of in between Southwark and Pennsport and a few other places, but this little area didn't have a name until in the mid-50s it would be designated for not just urban renewal but urban conservation. This was using private resources and public monies to rebuild a neighborhood, and they chose this one in particular because it was stable. A lot of other neighborhoods, especially white neighborhoods, that had gone into decline, you started seeing people leaving. This was what was happening in Kensington. This is what happening in a lot of places. People leaving, going to northeast Philadelphia, or going to the suburbs. People were staying in Whitman, at least at first, in the 1950s, and they said, okay, this is going to be a case study for the city to show how good urban renewal can be. That in a lot of other parts of the country, and a lot of urban renewal is seen as a very, very destructive process. A lot of razing homes, a lot of destroying communities, and so on in order to rebuild them, and it caused a lot of resentment, especially in African American communities. But they were going to this was going to be their case for why urban renewal works in this community. It was going to be Whitman. But, like everywhere else, there did need to be some raising of homes. Some things were dilapidated. Some things needed to be rebuilt. And the block or two of homes that the city raised in the mid-1950s was the block or two of homes occupied by African Americans. It was like in the outskirts of the neighborhood, the far end of the neighborhood. They were going to be torn down, and to replace them was going to be public housing. And this was part of the deal from the beginning. As soon as Whitman became, this symbol of urban renewal, public housing was going to be part of it. At first, the city was going to build high-rises, sort of tenement-style high-rise public housing you see in Chicago and other places like that. And the community fought that. The community in the 1950s and early 60s fought that. They said, and not because they knew that public housing was part of their community. It was because this isn't the type of housing we want in this neighborhood. There's no high rises around here. So the city shifts along working with the federal government, and then by the late 60s, the Department of Housing and HUD, Housing and Urban Development, working together, and so they adopt the idea instead of high-rise public housing, they're going to put in townhouses. And not only will these be townhouses with individual living spaces and all that, this is also going to be a new kind of public housing called Turnkey 3, whereas public housing tenants, if they make regular payments and do so for a number of years, they will have the option to then mortgage the house and turn public housing tenants into homeowners. I mean, this was the goal of public housing in the United States from the beginning, was always to help people move out into something else, and this was to do so in that house. By the early 70s, however, there was the neighborhood had changed. A lot of those people who had been involved in the early planning began to move out, started moving to Northeast Philadelphia and other places. And what we're left are the people who are decidedly more blue collar, decidedly more working class, who said they never knew that there was public housing coming this, and they were pretty upset about it. And they would then begin a long-standing. I mean, the one of the most acrimonious fights in the 1970s will be over the construction of public housing in Whitman, and it'll bring Rizzo into it. It'll bring civil rights, tenant rights, and all sorts of people into this fight, and it gets nasty. And at first, Rizzo, when he campaigns for mayor in 1971, says he will not allow public housing in any neighborhood that doesn't want it. And what's interesting about there's the guy who is the president of the opposition to public housing in Whitman is a guy named Fred Druding, and he was a self-proclaimed liberal. You know, he said I'm liberal, and he actually campaigned against Frank Rizzo when he was going up for the primary election. But then Rizzo made this promise, and the neighborhood becomes, I mean, in every election, in every one of Rizzo's election, Whitman has the highest percentage, one of the highest percentages of people who voted for Rizzo. Well over 90% of the neighborhood goes for Rizzo, because he promises them. He promises them. And so construction stops in 1973. It's picked up. Community leaders, community legal services gets involved, and they finally get this into federal court. And they make this about Rizzo. Rizzo has a reputation by the 1970s of being a racist. It came from his time as a police officer. And they bring this to the court and say, this is a clear pattern of reinforcing segregation in housing in Philadelphia. And they win. The civil rights the movement or leaders win. The tenants' rights people win. And construction recommences. And when construction recommences, people are out in the streets. There are women climbing on top of bulldozers and massive demonstrations, and it gets very, very heated until the townhouses will be built and they will open in 1982, and they're still there to this day. They're actually the Turnkey 3 worked, but it was a long and acrimonious fight, and Rizzo would honestly make things worse, I think, because by the late 1970s, as he's starting to lose his grip on power, he's had a very embarrassing moment with the bicentennial failure, and he's looking for ways to remain relevant, I guess, in a lot of ways. And he starts talking about how after he's mayor, he's going to lead a movement for white ethnic rights, not just in Philadelphia, but for anywhere. And he said, like, anywhere liberals want to come in and tell good people how to live. That's how he's framing it. But he's going to start this movement, but then he decides, no, instead of starting that movement, he's going to seek to change the city charter so he can run for a third term as mayor. And as well doing that, and he's making this stuff that's coming out of public housing very central. These arguments that are coming out of out of Whitman and out of another fight for this in Morrell Park in the far northeast. And while he's campaigning for charter change, appearing not in Whitman, but with another community group in Northeast Philadelphia that was also fighting the construction of public housing, he says, I'm going to say to the people of the city, vote white. Vote white. And that is a catalyst. I mean, that the African American voter turnout in the 1978 charter change amendment will be highest in the city's history to that point. It'll ring through, and it's where the sort of veil I refer to all this class language. It's colorblind. It's not about race. It's about class. And it starts to fall apart when Rizzo starts talking about white ethnic rights and starts talking about vote white, and it comes out of these public housing battles.
Well, when he was elected mayor and started governing, how did the job he did compare to the rhetoric he used to get the job?
Oh, so Rizzo was not a, I don't know, he was not an economic thinker. He was a guy that knew how to charge up a base. He was a guy that knew how to get things done for people. He knew how to talk to people. But he maintained a lot of the advisors that were there under the Tate administration, some of them stretching back from the Dilworth administration. And these were people that, these were people that still followed, that old urban growth liberalism ideas. And so I say, his mayoralty is a mix of this very cultural conservatism, anti-crime, anti-public housing, anti-segregation, all these things, anti-integration, all those things, but economically still trying to rebuild the city, the economy goes downhill in the 1970s, and they're struggling through some very difficult economic times, and they're using the same ideas that Tate, Dilworth, and Clark had been doing. These growth, public-private partnerships, trying to bring federal money, of which there's less of it, but bring federal money into the city for new programs and stuff. So he talks one side, but his administration does a lot of other things. I mean, so I guess one of the more famous and not Rizzo himself, but it's the Rizzo administration that really begins to lay the groundwork for making Philadelphia one of the capitals of the pharmaceutical industry in the United States as it is today. This was his economic advisors seeing the handwriting on the wall that deindustrialization was coming, and it was hitting the city, and it was hitting the city later than it did other places, but that the Philadelphia was going to need new industries, and they start recruiting these these big pharmaceutical companies to set up shop in Philadelphia, GlaxoSmithKline and some of those. And they won't really become central to the city's economy until the 80s and 90s, but they start laying the groundwork for bringing in these new industries. And so on the one side, he's talking about, blue-collar tradition, blue-collar values, but his advisors are seeing that this city's future is white-collar and service sector.
Well, the blue-collar workers, after 8 years of Frank Rizzo, were they better off, worse off, more integrated, less integrated? How did he leave them?
Well, that's a kind of a difficult question to answer because it depends on who you ask. Most of them would say they were better. Their economic standing didn't change. The city was still as segregated as it ever was before, but they believed that Rizzo made things better. The example that comes to mind immediately is crime. Crime undoubtedly goes up in Philadelphia in the 1970s. The economy is worse. There are less jobs and more people. Street crime just skyrockets in the 1970s. But to this day, I've had people tell me, "Oh, there was no crime in Philadelphia when Rizzo was mayor." It's like, yes, there was. It was worse when Rizzo was mayor, and I'm not saying that's his fault, but it was happening. But people still gave him credit for things like that. In a lot of ways, because he was, as they said, one of them, because he was that kind of a populist, they continued to see him as a success, even when it's really hard to see his mayoralty as successful. So many people wrote letters saying they believed the city was safe when he was there, regardless of what everything else said. And I don't want to say those people were wrong. It's not my place. But it's an interesting I don't want to say they were worse off if they believed they were better off, right? But I don't know what objective standards. And a lot of these things were things that were well beyond Rizzo's control. The broader changes in the American economy, in the American industrial economy, were not something any mayor or any team of advisors was going to be able to do anything. In the end, deindustrialization would have a much broader impact on blue collar fortunes and especially blue collar employment than anything this mayor did. But he made them feel better while doing it. Does that make while all those things were happening? Does that make sense?
Are there lessons from this book, from the Rizzo era and the era covered under your book, that can be drawn, that we can learn from today?
Yes, I hope so. Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think, as I stated earlier, there have been several people, and I was, because I was finishing writing this book in 2016. Eventually, President Trump does come in. Or at least when I was writing this, he was still in the campaign. There is something about their appeal and about the way that people respond to figures like Rizzo, figures like Trump. I've long, as many people have been making the comparison between them, I have long maintained that they are more different than they are similar. Rizzo was a row house kid, and he worked his way up. There's a very big difference between that and Trump's rise. But they appeal to people in the same way. They appeal to people through, sometimes resentment, but also sort of a celebration of those sort of values. In 2016, as I say, I point out in the book, Trump's son was out on the campaign trail for his father, Don Jr. was out calling his father a blue-collar billionaire. And I don't exactly know what that means, but I do. It's that cultural idea of blue collar. It has nothing to do with the fact that he lives in a gold penthouse in New York City, but he still has that sort of unpolishedness, and that's what Rizzo had, that's the sort of populism I think that is the lesson to bring out of it is how people are attracted to figures like this, because they speak to them, they speak their language, and they speak to them not just as part of it is resentment, but also sort of celebrating who they are. Think about the way the way Trump talks about blue collar work, jobs that don't really exist anymore. But he still talks about them with this sort of reverence and respect for that people believe they deserved when they had those jobs, when those jobs did exist.
Well, that's going to have to be the last word.
Okay,
We're out of time.
It kind of works pretty well.
We've been speaking with Timothy Lombardo. He is the author of this book, Blue Collar Conservatism, Frank Rizzo's Philadelphia and Populist Politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details. Like us on Facebook.